hi everyone, thank you very much for coming. My name's Erica Stanford. I've been asked to moderate the panel, been working blockchain for 3 years now, host the Crypto Curry Club, arguably the best networking events for blockchain around. Introducing a bunch of people here. I'll let them each stand up and introduce themselves. They'll do that far better than I ever could. So, Andrew.
Do I have to stand? I'm going to set the
stand.
tone here. Hi everyone, Andy Graham. I'm a financial services architect. And I've had the privilege to lead the WeTrade trade finance open account architecture from the idea through to now operation for 10 to 12 banks. So that's sort of, but generally I'm looking at all sorts of technology trends as it applies to financial services.
Thank you, Andy. Hi, Emmanuel Marchal, or Manu. I work for ConsenSys. ConsenSys was founded by one of the co-founders of Ethereum, Joseph Lubin. And at ConsenSys, I focus on the work with enterprise, and in particular, a couple of projects around commodity trade finance and large networks.
So, hello? Hello? No? Yes. Good?
Yes.
Much better. Hello, so my name is Sabine Azancot. I lead IBM's Digital Strategy practice in the UK. And I'm here really to represent, so I focus on blockchain, and it's really, I'm here to represent the fact that it's not all about tech. And I work on business value, on governance and operating model to figure out how to scale business networks around the blockchain.
Thanks, Sabine. My name is Jim Duffy. I'm the CEO of Tracr, which is the diamond traceability platform started by De Beers, and then spreading out the governance model to the rest of the diamond industry. You'll see some news about that through probably the end of the year.
So we've got a panel about blockchain being used in supply chain. I don't know what everyone's levels here is of understanding about blockchain. It's worth always noting, and these guys have all asked me to emphasize, that there's been a lot of hype around cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and ICOs and blockchain, and a lot of media, notably the FT, seem to think it's all exactly the same thing, and it's worth noting that digital currency is a separate thing to blockchain. Blockchain can be used as a software, it can be used as an accounting ledger, it can be used as a way of sending money or information, has many more uses than just being digital currency. So just to put that out there, there's also different types of blockchain. You can have blockchain that stores information in a wholly private manner, i.e. where you can control who has access to that information, or you have the more probably old or traditional version of blockchain, which is public, whereby everyone can see that information, to overly simplify. But looking at blockchain within supply chain, I think it's worth noting, as Sabine said, that the tech of blockchain is still advancing and is still changing every day in a really fast manner, but tech is actually sufficient now to do a lot with it. I would argue that probably 90% of the hurdles to blockchain adoption is public understanding, public trust, confusion, or the business element, or just the sheer cost or complexity of implementing blockchain, i.e. it's not the technology itself that's a limitation, it's now the people surrounding it. So what I thought would be really useful to do is actually look at some working use cases of how blockchain is already being used by some well-known companies and in some well-known use cases by brands that you all probably know, and to get these guys who are working with these companies to give some examples. So we've got a number of companies. We've got De Beers Diamonds, we've got Walmart, we've got, is it LVMH? Mm-hmm. And WWF Tuna. And you're talking about trade in general. So if you could each maybe just give an overview of, just very quick overview of what the company does and how you're actually using blockchain, what the benefits of blockchain are, as opposed to just using a CRM or a software or... Okay. Jim.
Okay, thank you. So for us specifically, on the Web 3.0 stage, we consider Tracr an Internet of Value platform. So when we think about the technologies involved, clearly security and privacy, IoT to connect the physical and digital worlds, AI, automated decision making, and then the distributed ledger technology. We're using Ethereum for the moment. We can think of Tracr for the diamond industry as a connected supply chain platform. Right now, there's a lot of disconnection between all the different businesses along the supply chain, from the producer, which is the miner, through the manufacturer, the people cutting and polishing these diamonds, through to the retailer, and then ultimately the consumer. The benefits are many. So the consumer can see traceability, provenance, and authenticity of the goods that they're purchasing. But then by connecting everything up using a distributed ledger, now we can get business efficiency across the entire supply chain. And it depends on where you are in the supply chain. The business efficiencies are different. But that's one of the benefits that we see of creating a digital asset on this kind of a platform, which represents the physical asset in the real world, and being able to trade that through different entities where we couldn't previously do that. And then other business efficiencies are driven by an application ecosystem above the platform itself.
Okay, so I'm going to try and build on this. So we have 40 plus business networks, but in supply chain is definitely amongst the more mature domains. I'll take the example of Walmart, but I could also talk about digital advertising and what we're doing with MediaOcean, for instance. So you think of so it always starts with pain points in multi-party transacting. In the case of Food Trust, or initially it was actually Walmart, there are, I think, in the world, 420,000 people every year that are affected of food poisoning. And the idea of being able to trace for certain categories, salads, pork, mango, whatever, the traceability and the store to source was really how it all started in terms of discussion. But when you think of it, it's also around the processes and the heavy friction points around documentation, around certification, around shipping documents. You see the same thing with TradeLens and Maersk. And so we started with Walmart. And now, if you look at how we've scaled this, we've actually taken that platform and built a consortium around all the retailers in the US, but also in Europe. So Carrefour is now, also involved. So I'd say that initially you have efficiency gain with traceability. It trickles through in terms of the experience for your partners, even your employees, in terms of interface, and you have massive gains of productivity on your everyday. When you enhance the customer experience, you then have a virtuous cycle that comes into play, and you can now think of new business revenues as well on top of it. So it's just the beginning of what blockchain and supply chain can do. And you can think of, 1/3 of all fresh consumer products in the world is actually wasted just because of not meeting the control quality. You could imagine how that's actually addressed and optimized. So there's really a virtuous loop around blockchain where you start with efficiencies and productivity, you enhance the experience, not only of the customers, the partners, the suppliers, and you then actually unlock new revenue models and new marketplaces. That's sort of the cycle. I hope that was...
Yeah, thank you, Sabine. So I'll give 2 examples to continue on what you said. The first one is around commodity trade finance, and I'll cover why blockchain. So the world of commodity trade finance, if you have ever heard of that space, we're talking about shipping oil, gas, mineral, metals, and grains around the world. So that's about tens of trillions of dollars being shipped every year. And all that require financing, or most of it require financing. And so we're talking about fairly complex financing with very high stakes. And right now it's done traditionally, mostly on paper, because when you ship some goods in some part of the world, you don't have internet connectivity, you don't have all the advances that you have here in the Western world, or in Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore. And so this whole industry is still very, very paper-based, and 90% of the data that's put on paper get lost. It gets written once, checked by the banks who need to issue the financing, and never used again. So there's a massive amount of inefficiency in that process to finance commodity. And so you could imagine a central repository where all the banks put their transactions, put their documents, and you have a prime solved. The prime is the banks will not trust each other enough or don't trust a third party to store all their information there. And that's where blockchain comes in, is to allow all these parties to use a common protocol or common language that's digital to be able to issue financing. So that's the first use case. And then if we talk about second one, that's not about food, but about luxury goods. So I don't know if anyone, not diamonds, processed diamonds, or let's talk about bags, handbags, or products from LVMH, Louis Vuitton. So here one of the challenges they have is there's a lot of fakes. And the second one is in Asia, there's a very large secondary market of people reselling the bags. Legitimate owners of the bags, they want to resell it and want to prove that the bag is real, is a legitimate bag. And so there's a platform that just launched based on blockchain where you get public proof of the authenticity of the bag. That's now available to anyone. And for the brand, for LVMH and the various brands of LVMH, it allows them to reconnect with their buyers, even through the secondary market, even on the other side of the world. So these are two concrete use cases where blockchain add value.
Thank you. So I see this through three lenses in terms of movement of things. So we've talked about the movement of goods, handbags and diamonds. The movement of money we could talk about, and there's also the movement of data. And the WeTrade example for open account trade finance was the movement of data. So if we are trading and open account trade finance for small to medium enterprises in Europe is a $1.5 trillion opportunity in terms of flow of money. But these small clients are typically underserved, small to medium enterprises. So blockchain is just a technology. In the work I've done, 80% is not blockchain related, but blockchain has been the reason for competitors. In this instance, 12 banks who typically are fiercely competitive, coming together, creating a new utility, a new consortia to try and serve this market. And in the end, it's about trust. And for anti-competition or competition laws, especially in Europe, these parties can't see each other's data. So you have to build in, as well as the trust, the security, tamper resistance proof, you have to build in everything to be able to work in that the vision of blockchain where you run a node, you run a node, you run a node, and we trust all the administrators to make this work. And it's not just blockchain, it's about all the existing controls. So I guess in diamonds, you're still going to have physical security guards and cages and custodies involved. That doesn't go away. You're just trying to improve control and trust on the edge as it relates to digital.
So on the note of controlling trust, once information is on blockchain, one can see what happens. And the age-old question, which no one has a perfect answer to, how do you trust the information uploaded to blockchain? Do any of you have any good, novel, innovative working solutions to that?
We've got one.
Sorry?
We've got one. How we trust what goes onto the blockchain to begin with is we start at the absolute front of the supply chain, as you'd have to if you're going to trace something. We have a hardware-software solution that allows us to automatically scan diamonds in the sorting country, in the producing country, at the sorting facilities, and then trace them all the way through. The data then grows over time and gets attached to the digital asset, and we can watch that entire journey from really the very beginning of when these things are found. Sometimes we can imagine a moment where the platform will observe the thing first. Diamonds were created about 1 billion years ago or more, and the platform will be the first thing to see it eventually and trace it all the way through the supply chain.
I'm going to go one higher level up. I think that it all starts with smart contracts. It all starts with governance. I mean, it all happens before it even starts, in other words. If you're able to translate the contracts that you have into business rules, and from there develop your smart contracts and algorithm around this, you've already done a lot of the troubleshooting, because you're really clear about the governance. If it's permission-based, you're really clear about who has access to what information at what stage of the decision. And it's not everybody has access to everything at all time. You're really clear from the outset on how you're going to design your network and the number of nodes, because it's not the number of participants equals the number of nodes. It might not be scalable this way. So I think that most of it, in terms of partner onboarding and the rules around that, the policies, the governance, and the smart contract, it happens even before it starts.
So the data that goes in, just like any system and any database. I mean, if you think of a database as a system of record, they've been used for a very long time, and we trust them because we trust the organization that run them. In the blockchain, and the same prime of putting junk in, you get junk out. So I would say that prime is unrelated to blockchain. You need to use the same principle when you put data in. If poor quality data goes and is written on the blockchain, you can still spot where the data come from. And I would argue that with blockchain, you even have, because you have built-in provenance of where the data come from, what changed the data, it's very easy to find the source of problem. And so because you get this built-in provenance, you get the ability to correct the original issue much faster. So I see benefits. At the same time, if it's written and it's wrong, it's okay, you can still modify it. You will know who modified it, so again, you get benefits.
Right, so in terms of the privacy side, it's highly contextual. So it depends on the moment in the process flow. Should that data, and you have to decide that upfront in the rule book and the run book very early on. So in that moment in time, am I the auditor? Do I need to trust you? Do we need a third party and a notary to try and attest what's going on? Do I just want to show you one field? Do I want to show you the whole record? Should that only be in existence when we negotiate the trade? So it has to get to field level trust. And some of this will be public, some will be private, so it'll be a real spectrum. But I'll just reiterate the need to document this up front in the rule book, which defines the business products and all those privacy things, because those decisions quickly go into code and unfortunately they're very hard to change. Yeah.
And by the way, it's at that moment that you identify what's blockchain related and what's not.
Absolutely.
Actually, because blockchain is never on its own. And so automation, analytics come into play, for instance, and are relevant. So that's really, and so again, it's really, before it even starts, you've done a lot of the work.
Especially with lawyers and contracts.
Because
you're trying to recreate the digital world, and I guess in the DIMA world, you're trying to recreate as is, you're trying to change the process a bit to be more efficient. But you're heavily constrained by law.
That's right. We've gone to great lengths at Tracr to make sure that we're building a robust application ecosystem above the platform. And to get that right, it's the data sharing and privacy. Completely granular at each step. People can choose what they're passing down, basically downstream, without interrupting traceability. And that gives us that nice balance.
That brings an interesting topic when we talk about security, is who chooses what needs to be private or public, and the topic of governance.
Sure.
So when you build these blockchain networks, you typically build them, well, in some cases you build them because you get multiple parties that don't trust each other, and the blockchain is the trust machine, as The Economist flagged in 2015. So it's something that allows all these parties to work in a trustless environment. However, deciding who chooses how that network operates is often a topic of lots of discussions. And so on our side, we've seen cases where the network are built by multiple companies trying to come together, create a non-profit organization, and effectively build a utility network where they don't seek profit out of that, they just try to create that network to reduce their operating cost. On the flip side, you got networks that are built by for-profit company, where there's a clear, independent, unique entity that choose and make the decisions, build a network, make it available to the rest. And then you got everything in between.
Yes, I'd corroborate this, because Food Trust started with Walmart, and you could see that as a founders network, Walmart being at the center with all its suppliers. Very soon, as more retailers were interested with the proposition, it became more of an industry play and platform. So the whole operating model and even the investment model and funding model needs to be revisited. So we focus a lot from the outset on the business value design to really understand what's in it for all participants and how, as it scales, that dynamic changes, and it's dynamic business modeling. And that can actually trigger a new governance, a new setup of operating model. So it's it's a complex area.
It's complex. And there's multiple lenses. You look at the commercial lens, who's going to make money, the incentive model. You've got to look at the operation, who's going to run this and disclose of this. The growth model, who's going to sell this and market this. And then you've got to agree the roadmap. Yeah, there's a long backlog, a lot of requirements, who's going to do this. And the more parties you had, the one I was involved with, 12 parties, that's a lot of controls, a lot of securities, a lot of opinions, and it just slows your velocity. And if you want to go at startup speed with that number of people compared to a founder network, it's a conscious decision you've got to address up front very early.
I'd say that it's a difficult ramp up, but once you get into a certain degree of maturity, you take TradeLens, Maersk, shipping. We now have 100 plus participants on that business network. They're not all business network participant. We have a lot of suppliers as well. Let's say 70-30 or that type of. So it's really it's now a business network that has multiple shippers. It has possibly within its ecosystem 50% of all our shipment data, and data is the asset. Or, over time, that's where you have this opportunity to monetize. So it's really you really need to look this as a dynamic, organic, scaling beast, and they become companies on their own. You're going to have SMEs, multinationals, and in the future, you'll have those business networks to deal with that you can supply to as well. So it's a fascinating cross-industry, new space, I would say.
So one question relating to trust, and I know people ask for a bit of controversy here. There's more and more trends towards companies going towards private blockchains, i.e. where the data added to blockchain is effectively controlled and limited to designated people, as opposed to everyone in the world being given access, which was maybe the initial idea of blockchain, at risk of oversimplifying. But with a lot of enterprises, such as I think all of yours, going towards a private model, the question some would ask is, how would people outside of those ones given access to that data trust that organization? Then it goes back to a traditional centralized model. What advantages does blockchain bring in that sense? Debate.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I could start with that one. So the way that we've thought about this in terms of how we'll roll out Tracr in terms of a private network for the industry and by the industry is what we say about Tracr. So industry participants, as they work together today, will work together on the platform. We can think about a time maybe in the future where it's kind of hybrid, or maybe by way of how we're implementing the data sharing ecosystem, we can open that up to people who need the governance lens or the governmental lens outside of that. Just to reiterate on the last point, Tracr is going to be a non-commercial initiative, and then above that there'll be the commercial opportunity of applications, and then the sharing through the data ecosystem. We could give any lens into the platform that we need to, which is consistent across the platform. So it's a nice balance as a first version for the industry.
I'm going to use the TradeLens Maersk example today. So you have 100 participants, but not all of them are network, are part of the network. Some of them are just supplying to that business network. So, and you'll have industry bodies, you have regulator, eventually you have a whole ecosystem around private networks that are possible. It's not incompatible. You just have to have a governance around how you onboard those participants. Moreover, as it evolves and mature, you're going to have networks of networks. So different business networks connecting with each other. And this is where you might have some hybrid configuration with global trade, global logistics, finance, and so those networks sort of connecting with each other. It's further down the road in complexity, but that's basically the sort of roadmap to it.
Yeah, I think for the next 3 to 5 years, each function in these networks will grow on its own. So if we talk about trade finance for commodity, that's a very specific area. There's 1 or 2 initiatives globally that have critical mass, enough critical mass. That means enough banks behind it to make it work. Same in the shipping area. We'll see this grow up to the point where they will collide, they will compete. And then I think one or two things will happen. You're going to have one that's bigger than the other, and you're going to have merger and acquisition, or one will starve the other of customers. And that's what happens in, I mean, think of social network. There's one social network today, but there's multiple social networks. There's the public social network, that's Twitter. There's the enterprise social network, that's LinkedIn, and then the social network, that's Facebook. And they all found their niche, but there's one main one for each space. And then there's a lot of smaller ones that are more specialized for niche markets. So I think that will happen. Second thing that's likely to happen is the technology right now is not at a stage where it allows private network to operate on public networks. And here, the analogy I'm making is intranet, internet. 20 years ago, all companies had intranet. Now, when you create a company, you don't build an intranet. The first thing you do is try to find external services that you use to operate your company. Nobody creates their own email server unless you're in a political campaign to run your mail service. And so the same will happen with blockchain. And that transition happened for people to go from private to public as the security of using public network was well understood and the security mechanisms were evolved enough. The same is happening with blockchain. We're developing the technology right now to allow for private transaction to happen on public network. There's technology like zero knowledge proof that allows some of this. We're still early stage. People are still trying to understand the governance of using these things and the legal consequences of using these things. But in 5 years, we're probably going to be at a stage where enterprise will feel comfortable enough to operate on public network using this technology. And at that point, you're going to see the private network that are built today slowly shifting to operate on public or connecting between each other through the public network.
That's right. I think these things are very complicated. So at the moment, it's one byte at a time. But I can see, so what's missing is like the individual identity. If I'm signing a contract, that's very hard. If there are a pool of 100,000 small to medium enterprises, I don't have an identity for each one of those individuals, let alone those companies. So at the moment, it's signed on behalf of a bank, for instance. So I see this hybrid. So if we get to self-sovereign identity and that identity revolution, so that would probably be more, it's more public, as in it's not controlled by the enterprise. But a lot of this is B2B still, so there's going to be these different tiers of service. And maybe the movement of the container is out there. It doesn't really matter that someone knows. They don't know what's in it. They don't know who owns it, who's financing it. So over time, there'll be an onion. In the middle is the crown jewels, and then it will go out to the more public-facing. But as I say, these are very complicated, one thing at a time. That's why we're not trying to do all at once.
And one key question to ask, if you look at all of your industries, there's still a load of blood diamonds. There's still UK supermarkets losing hundreds of millions a year because of not being able to track their data. Still huge problems with luxury goods, and 10% of all food is not what you think it is, or more in some cases in some countries. Fine wines, there's a lot of issues still that could, in theory, easily be addressed by blockchain. Why do you think other diamond companies, other supermarkets, other luxury good providers, why do you think they haven't yet gone to blockchain?
So in the diamond industry specifically, they have gone to blockchain. So now the largest, and for those who aren't familiar, a small number of companies in the world, less than a couple dozen, is a large part of the industry. There's really two large producers, and then the rest of the world. There's a lot of midstream sort of manufacturers, and then there's a number of large retailers. They're all lining up to adopt this kind of a platform because, back to the point on blood diamonds, I think that they're eager to show, and I've seen this firsthand, the problems have been solved a long time ago, but to show objective proof is what's possible with this kind of platform. And showing that the size of the problem is diminishing quickly, but then also to really reinforce not only just, okay, we say blood diamonds, but really it's more about sustainability and ethical sourcing of diamonds and equitable distribution of the supply chain. And proving these things on this kind of a platform is really the point, and the industry is eager to do that.
I'd say that in retail, it's happening. I mean, I'd be surprised if, any major retailer is not considering this. In the US, we have on Food Trust some of the main retailers, and it's actually scaling in Europe. I think in supply chain, there are tangible outcomes that have we have proof points now in terms of value add. So we hadn't solved those problems before. So the store to source, from 7 days to a number of seconds, depending on the category, this is a real tangible outcome. We can talk about digital advertising as a very complex supply chain, where it used to be that it was the advertiser and publisher, and $1 would convert into 85 cents at the end. Now it's $1 to 40 cents, and between that, and between that you have the MPs, SSPs, DSPs, etc. We're now looking at that and trying to at least establish some financial transparency within using blockchain. You think of 40 billion value leakage in programmatic advertising, half of which is fraud related, probably another big 7 billion is just the inefficiencies and operational efficiencies, and the rest is just wasted non-working media. But we're trying to tackle this. It takes time, and we talked about the challenges around governance, around operating models, and it's less about the tech actually. It's co-opetition. It's understanding that sometimes, and most of the time, it's not so much about disintermediating, but really adding that transparency throughout, right?
And the adoption is happening, but we're still in the early days. Think of programmable blockchain having been invented less than 5 years ago. And in 2015, 16, 17, people were trying to figure out what to do in enterprise context with that technology. 17, 18, people were doing real-life pilots. And the first production network came up in the second half of 2018. So now we are seeing these first networks starting to gain adoption, as you mentioned, here in Congo, in trade finance. It's now 15 participants in energy trading, oil and gas trading. There's large networks, again, that have a critical mass of users with the oil and gas company. Same in open finance. So it's still fairly early days. There's also an interesting trend. In parallel of all the mainstream, or I would call legacy companies, there's a whole new category of companies that are emerging that are sidestepping what the large companies are doing. And that's Web3. People building on Web3, and Tracr is a very good example of that, where we're going to disrupt the entire business model, create a new feature that allow for more participation. And there's tons of examples in that space that is happening in parallel.
Yeah, I think it's starting B2B, but when you're trying to think about the whole supply chain, for instance, you've got to get a farmer to implement a new technology. It's got to be easy. It's got to be waterproof. Yeah, if someone's packing something on the back of a lorry, it's just got to work and not impact the current speed of doing business. So it's going to start the middle for those trusted wholesale sort of work, and then it will go B2B to C in the end. But it'll take a while. It'll take a while.
And super quickly, we've got just less than 10 minutes left, so I'll give these guys a chance to ask questions. But you guys wanted to discuss / debate interoperability. So if you've got maybe a one-sentence answer that's almost as blunt as Andrew's one in the back, maybe.
Okay, so this is an easy one for me. The physical world has intersections between industries. Whether that's gold and a diamond, we know you mount the thing and you wear it on your finger, or maybe it's mounted on some luxury good or something like that. That interoperability in the real world is what we should put in the digital world. If our platform intersects with Trust Chain for gold, or the LVMH Aura platform for luxury goods, that makes a lot of sense to me. We shouldn't duplicate that or try to do it a different way.
I should add that interoperability is how blockchain or platforms can effectively relate to each other or work with each other, by way of explanation.
Yes, I'll say that Manu's analogy between intranet and internet was actually touching on interoperability to some point, to some level. Things can move on without having solved the interoperability question to the end extent. There are discussions right now on interoperability within the protocols, the Hyperledger, Ethereum, etc. It's going on. It's going to take time, but actually you can have cross chains. It's open standard. It's open, open source. You have APIs. You can actually make sure that you connect at different levels of the stacks and continue progressing as this formalizes. So.
Yeah, if you're in the space, you're probably aware of it, but if not, there's a lot of groups that work on standards. So for example, in the Ethereum space, which is probably the largest space in terms of number of developers involved in blockchain technology, there's a group that's called the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, made of about 300 organizations. And what they're trying to do is create a standard for the code or for the API, so that every company that tries to build product for Ethereum, make them compliant to that standard, which means as a buyer, you have multiple options. You don't get locked by one single supplier. So that's an important step. And then between Hyperledger, the open source Hyperledger Foundation, and the Ethereum Foundation, there's also work to make interoperability between the two. And so yeah, that's going to be interesting to see how these two blockchains can communicate. The next one is around digital asset and tokenization. So that's a very interesting property of having a distributed ledger and smart contract. Is you can make assets live online and then effectively track their financial value online. And so this whole aspect of creating a digital equivalent of a physical asset or logical asset. And here the question is whether everybody's going to default to one single default network for transacting these assets or not. In the Ethereum space, the majority of people believe that Ethereum will be the base layer.
Early investor.
And the other chains will connect to the base layer to then exchange the asset that they have on each of the chains.
So I think the problem's about integration and interconnectivity and not interoperability, to be fair. So I think you've got to start. So if my business product is trade finance and I have clients and you have documented trade and you have customers, do our business products even work together? So even if I can technically interoperate, you need to get the rule books aligned, the business products aligned, the data aligned, the processes aligned, security aligned, the lawyers are aligned, before you even get into the technical magic.
So it goes back to not being the tech, it's just the 90%.
No, you need to
that is
get,
the people
you have to have
and the acceptance and work.
Yeah,
and
equal focus on the 4 layers.
Yeah.
And right now you can link with RESTful APIs, and there's work on hashed time-lock contracts, work on relays, all sorts of middle bridges. So the tech and standards will creep up. But to me, start with the business products. Are these things going to work together, even without the technology? Yeah, and interoperability is a dream. For me to take an app and just run it on your smartphone and it will just work, no, it doesn't happen. So you still have to go to attestations, certifications, and everything else. So focus on integration right now. Can I write a contract? Can I read it separately elsewhere using different technologies? But get the rule books aligned first before you worry about that tech.
Agreed. There's still going to be an element of wherever there's a larger number of assets being transacted, the secondary market will be created there.
There'll be huge opportunities.
And so there's clearly a huge opportunity for, and I think that's why I believe we're going to see one network probably host the majority of assets, because of the secondary market opportunity that will be open.
Assets will be everywhere. Assets will be in my wallet, in my secure wallet on my phone. They'll be in my bank. They'll be in Bank of New York Mellon. They'll be in who knows where. So to me, it's all about atomic settlement. It's about how do I swap my loyalty cards and my magic sword for real fiat, for a diamond. So to me, the real value is that atomic swap. So that's where there's friction, that's where there's money. So to me, that's where the value is.
I think the picture is more networks of networks, and really how it's going to evolve. I don't necessarily see a convergence to one network over time.
Absolutely not.
From a practical perspective.
Guys, I'm going to cut you off here because we're probably down to the last few minutes. I'm going to thank everyone who stayed in this freezing cold tent. I'm frozen, so thank you and congratulations to enduring. Does anyone have any sort of super quick pressing questions for these?
I wanted to ask one about sort of essentially legal regulations, sort of how you build into a blockchain, given that laws can change, policies can change. And as such, sort of, how do you sort of make sure that
you can keep supply chains able to change in the fact that that could propose a potential security risk. And it's like, what's best practice for the fact that the standards that you're working with can change and you may have to change, and you're sort of avoiding a fork that sort of destroys a lot of the properties of the network? If that is,
So
makes sense.
regulations, they're always going to be industry specific. And so I'll give you an example in trade finance. One you touched upon that is antitrust. So you cannot have all the banks come together, create a network, because that wouldn't be okay. And therefore, in that case, antitrust regulators looked at the feasibility of this network before this network could even launch. So in that case, there was nothing to change in the regulation. In fact, the blockchain technology allowed for this network to exist. That's one aspect. Another aspect, like fundraising or tokenization, or clearly here, regulators are behind what was made available to people, and now they're catching back to make sure that we get safe environment. In our space, ConsenSys, we're highly involved with the regulators to create a much safer environment for investors.
Yeah, and you've got to design these networks to change. There will be security things that need to change. There will be rules which have code changes into your smart contract. So you've got to design it up front, and you have rules to say, yes, do all nodes have to have the same version of that law? At what point do the other ones drop off? So you've got to design for change, unfortunately. But
I'd say that, and we see this in the cross between IoT and security as well, understanding how actually devices or sensors can be active participant to a blockchain network, and even sources of data to validate or even flag any tampering. So if anything, you can see this as a blanket, an overlay of security with a governance, but also in terms of device identity, certification, validation, data integrity, even network integrity. So you could use blockchain for that very purpose, actually, if that makes sense.
One more question.
Hi, my name's Carmen Benitez. I'm with a company called Fetch Blockchain, and it kind of goes into this gentleman's earlier question with the IoT and how sometimes IoT isn't necessarily built specifically with the programming of a blockchain, but it's more just open. And so there's a lot of, if you think back to Cisco days, there was that massive, they breached Cisco's operating systems from a television's frequency. So I can imagine with the IoT and the supply chain that there are those potential malware types of breaches that can happen that can then trigger the blockchain from stopping. And that's a big economic risk for a supply chain provider, those that are in the food processing, for example. So what are you all seeing as ways of preventing the things that are not necessarily protected through a blockchain, but that help to function the blockchain? What are you seeing as best practices to help the blockchain continuously act the way it should?
it's not easy. I guess I'm an architect. Starts with the context diagram. Is that my problem to solve in terms of the solution? And then if there is a malware check in an IoT device, you'll know quite quickly whereabouts it is. So a lot of this is about making it better than it is now. And over time, you'll try and solve all the way down to that individual device having a certificate, signing itself. But I think, it's not easy. But I think on the edge, it's less of a problem than in the middle to start.
One of the opportunities we have while building Tracer is to set an open data standard across the industry, probably the first of its kind now. And with that is IoT data standards, et cetera, et cetera. And now we can start to pick up these fingerprints in what might be a malware attack. That's probably an outlier as a use case. Diamond's so small and valuable, the zones that these IoT devices are in are extremely controlled. But still, it's more around the efficiency play about how we can speak the same data dialects and interoperate together better.
I'd say back to the example I just made around the roles of sensors and devices, as elemental sources of data on the blockchain network. We have the ability of actually to spot the issues and locate the issues much quicker. It's actually more visible in many ways. And it's an overlay of already a security blanket around what you can use in cloud or in analytics or cybersecurity. So it's never on its own. It's in conjunction with. It can regulate the data access right, the partner onboarding right. So it's an added layer, foundation layer to an IoT platform, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So.
And blockchain's not standalone. So in the things I do, I work with cloud. I work with machine learning, for instance. As a classic case, is that the trend? I'm seeing IoT devices everywhere. Is this one tracking compared to the history? So we can apply other tech together to help the business problem.
Yeah, there's like always for software, you're going to have issues, you're going to find them, you're going to fix them, it's going to get better. Just like intranet, internet, it's because the routers and the firewalls get better and better, and we understood better that we allowed intranet to operate on top of internet. Same will happen here. The other thing is with blockchain, we get less centralization of data. That means there's less of a large honeypot for hackers to go in. And so some of the risk is displaced. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's displaced. The idea that you would hack one database and get 100 million records is now no longer valid in blockchain world. And so that risk is moved away. There's a different risk that came in because now we're decentralized. We get nodes around the edges. But like all digital systems, as you move the risk, you move on to the next one. So.
Indeed.
That's a great point.
Cool. Thanks, Rob.